I'm Dr. Laura Gifford. The results that we have gotten in this place clinically have been astounding. We need to eat food that's real. Ditch the sugars and the grain. Fat doesn't make you fat. Fat does not cause heart disease. You literally are what you eat. Let's talk about insulin and where it comes from and what happens in the body.
I'm Dr. Jillian Murphy. This is definitely not what I was taught in school. This is what I thought that food should be able to do for people. There's that old adage, you are what you eat, but you really actually are what you digest. The ultimate health combination is vegetables plus protein plus healthy fat. Cholesterol gets such a bad rap. All of our sex hormones come from cholesterol. Healthy poop versus not so healthy poop. Any questions about that?
I'm Michelle McKelvin. 80% of our body composition is based on what we eat. Move frequently at a slow pace. Lift heavy things. Resistance training. It's not too late. You can put muscle mass on at any age. You really don't need weights or machines. Posture is really, really important.
If it comes from a factory and has an ingredients list, it's not whole food. It's not the way nature intended it. And you'd be amazed. We are abundant the amount of food we actually have that comes from the earth or roams the earth. That's really what we're designed to eat.
Didn't think there would be a day where I didn't really want to. Anyway, today, saturated fat. So, I don't know, my slide's a bit funny, but the controversy, is it possible that everything we've been taught about fat is a big fat lie? So we're going to talk about saturated fat, and this tends to be one of the biggest questions or concerns that people have when it comes to eating like this. Even people who are not necessarily paleo but who are really into coconut oil will often come up to me and say, what's the deal? Like, I've heard it's healthy, but isn't it a saturated fat? And so there's lots of questions about fat and what's healthy. So the little comic is our menu is divided into 3 sections: cancer-causing foods, artery-clogging foods, and foods that are being boycotted for political or environmental reasons. And I just put that up there because I feel like, I mean, you guys seem to be taking this all in stride, but for some people, you know, this really challenges some of the things that they've been taught about food and health and nutrition, and it almost feels like everywhere we turn, someone's giving us a bit of a different message. And I've had, you know, more than one person say, like, there's nothing left to eat. Like, you know, these people are saying I should be vegan, and these people are saying I should be paleo, and these people are saying I should be organic, and these people are saying I should be whatever. It can be really confusing and hard to sort of sort through the information. So we're going to challenge some information tonight. Feel free to ask lots of questions, and hopefully we'll find a place where you feel comfortable eating the food you're eating. Saturated fat is bad, has been the message that we've always been given. And so what I want to do tonight is challenge it. Is it possible that fat isn't making us fat, isn't responsible for chronic disease, and isn't to be feared? Is it possible that saturated fat might even be kind of good for us? And if so, how have we become so misled? Because it is very common knowledge, right, that saturated fat is not good for us. Common knowledge. So I want to start with this. This is the lipid hypothesis, and this is basically, we're going to look at the research that sort of led to the lipid hypothesis, but this is the hypothesis that underlies basically all cardiovascular treatment in the medical community today. And the hypothesis is this: we eat saturated fat, and we'll talk about where saturated fat comes from in a minute, but we eat saturated fat and it increases our blood cholesterol. So it's a fat that's found in our blood. When we increase our blood cholesterol, we develop atherosclerosis. And atherosclerosis is a condition of a thickening and hardening of the walls of our arteries, which makes it harder to pump blood through, harder to get oxygen to our tissues, and specifically if those arteries happen to feed the heart, the theory is that it can lead to death, so heart attacks and death. Okay? So the hypothesis is we eat cholesterol, we get higher blood cholesterol, we get coronary artery disease, and we die. And that is literally the foundation of all of their treatments. That's the foundation of the pharmaceuticals that they prescribe, the diets that they recommend. That is the hypothesis. And before we get into where that hypothesis came from, let's just quickly talk about where saturated fat comes from. Does anybody know, just physically looking at fats, how you could tell if something's saturated or unsaturated? the nutrition student at the back.
If it's solid at room temperature, I think is the guideline.
Yeah. If it's solid at room temperature, it's saturated, and that just has to do with the way that the chemical composition, the bonds, are developed. Unsaturated fats are liquid at room temperature, so you're thinking like vegetable oils. Olive oil is monounsaturated. Saturated fat tends to come from animal products and tropical plants. So palm, coconut, and then animal. Fish oil is a funny one. People always say, is that saturated? I don't understand. But, fish oil is actually mostly unsaturated. There's a little bit of a saturated component to it, but it's mostly unsaturated. But, it is an animal product, obviously. What about trans fats or hydrogenated fats? Does anybody know what those actually are? Those tend to get lumped in with saturated fats as, the bad ones. But does anybody know what the difference is between a saturated fat and a trans or a hydrogenated fat? No. Basically, hydrogenating fat was a process that was developed to make fats more shelf stable. And so the whole idea was we're going to switch up the chemical composition of a fat by heating it. So they heat it to very, very high temperatures, and they change the structure so that it becomes shelf stable. So obviously it's cheaper. So if they can put a hydrogenated fat into crackers and cookies and these types of things, they can sit on the shelf for months and months and months, because fats go bad very easily. So I remember when I first started this, I went to Bulk Barn and got almond flour, and I made muffins with it. It tasted really, really good. And then I made another batch and it was awful. I'm like, I don't understand. I thought I liked these, whatever. But what I realized was that the almond flour actually went rancid. So now I keep I keep nuts in the fridge all the time. I keep all of my flours in the freezer because fats go bad. Even butter, I keep it on the counter sometimes, but it shouldn't be there for very long because it will go rancid. So fat goes bad. And what they've done with most of these, nutritional processes is they're just trying to make more money. So if they change the chemical composition, A, it can sit on a shelf, and B, it can sit on a shelf for a really, really, really long time. And so hydrogenated, they're adding in some hydrogens. Trans fat is through the heating process. And trans just refers to the sort of chemical structure of the fat. And the reason they're so bad for us is because our cells all have, we're composed of millions, billions of cells, and every single cell in our body has a fatty lipid membrane that keeps the good stuff in the cell and the stuff we don't want in the cell outside of it. And that membrane is made up of fat. And constantly, like a lot of the work of our body on an ongoing basis is trying to keep cells healthy, repairing cell walls, replacing cells that are damaged. It's the whole sort of like oxidizing antioxidant thing that's going on in the body. And we could talk a lot about it, but those membranes are made of fat. And they're made of fat in a really specific structure. And when we start introducing hydrogenated fats and trans fats, instead of helping to build healthy cell membranes, they actually destroy and damage cell membranes. So they're increasing the oxidization that's happening in our body all the time. They put us at increased risk for cancer. They put us at increased risk for aging. They put us at increased risk for chronic disease, because they're continually damaging the cells we're trying to keep healthy, right? And so most foods now are starting to try and keep hydrogenated and trans fats out of them, but I can remember as early as, it's easy because we forget once we learn these things, but I remember as early as 8 or 9 years ago, being at my cousin's house before I started naturopathic school, and her not knowing, had never heard of what a hydrogenated fat was, or trans fat, and me trying to explain, and people thought I was crazy. Like, oh, you're so obsessive. And it's like, now it's just common knowledge, right? Like these foods are not super good for us. But saturated and trans and hydrogenated are very, very different, right? So the point is that saturated fat is found in animals and tropical plants. It's naturally found. We've ingested it for long periods of time. Trans and hydrogenated fats are man-made. They're chemically made, and they were made the same way, that high fructose corn syrup was made, with the intention of making food cheaper to make. That's the purpose of it, okay? So how did we start to believe that that lipid hypothesis that I was telling you. There was a lot of studies that were done, and we now know, and we'll talk about it in a bit, but we know that those studies were really flawed. Like they were really, really, really bad. But the demonization of saturated fat actually started in the early 1900s, and it really started with Crisco. So Crisco is crystallized cottonseed oil, and originally it was used to make soap and candles. And then with the advent of electricity, all of a sudden, Crisco's not doing so well. So let's remarket, let's rebrand, let's change our angle. Yeah, and so they started to market it as a plant-based, healthier alternative to all of the animal fats that people were eating. So prior to that, you're thinking like, your grandma, right? She would have, my grandma still cooks with, or uses suet in things, suet, tallow. They would have used lard, they would have used butter. They would have predominantly used animal fat. So animal fat that they would have bought in the form of butter, or that they would have salvaged from their cooking, like schmaltz or tallow or suet, so saving it from cooking animal products. And that's predominantly what people cooked with. It's predominantly what they ate in terms of fat. And then all of a sudden things started to change because this was healthier. It was plant-derived, and there was a really strong sort of marketing push. And then we get into the research that was coming out around the same time. And some of the research started with a Russian physician who did a study on rabbits, where he fed rabbits cholesterol, and the rabbits developed atherosclerosis, and they developed artery disease. So he's feeding them cholesterol, and he's finding that their arteries are getting thicker and they're getting harder, and the rabbits are sick. So this starts to develop this theory behind cholesterol and saturated fat not being very good for us. Then the Framingham study, I don't know if any of you guys have ever heard of it. It's like the biggest heart study that has ever been done. Started in 1948 and continued for 25, 30 years, happened in Massachusetts, and again, it's where a lot of the research that has been, a lot of the information that has been pulled from research on heart health and how we take care of our cardiovascular system has come from this study. 5,000 participants, and again, they're following the same people for sort of 25, 30 years to see what's going on. And originally what they found was those with increased blood cholesterol were more likely to be diagnosed with coronary artery disease and die. So this was in like the early days of the study. So the first 5-10 years, this is what they're concluding from their information. And then this was huge. So this was like on the cover of magazines at this time. Ernest Keyes was a researcher who did a couple of studies. He actually did 3, but these were the first 2, a 6-country study and a 7-country study. And so what he did was he looked at different countries and he looked at their fat intake. And then he started to look, at percent calories from fat and then cardiovascular diseases. And so what his studies showed when he plotted them out, when he plotted, Japan, Italy, England, Canada, US, is the higher the calories from fat were, the higher the incidence of death from cardiovascular disease. So this was a really big deal. This was when things really started to change. So this was like when the big push for vegetable oils came. So this was only, we're looking at like 50, 60 years ago. So not very long ago at all. And like I said, this guy was, on the cover of magazines, like very famous for these studies. And so in response to those studies, in response to that research, the government starts issuing new nutritional recommendations. So they start changing up the way that they're recommending people eat. And the big thing was increase your grains, decrease your fat. That was the huge message. The American Heart Association promotes the Ornish diet. Dean Ornish, he's still, I had someone come in my office the other day and they said their cardiologist recommended the Ornish diet for her husband who had had a heart attack. And again, it's really sorry, I've got 2 highs there. It's really, really low fat, high carbohydrate. So lots of cereal, lots of grains, lots of fruit, vegetables, and like little to no animal product and little to no fat. No fat. And again, it was all designed to prevent heart disease based on the research. There was big marketing. We're always marketing to kids and trying to get the information to kids, but they started developing these characters, and sat and trans were lumped together as the bad fats. This was more recently, so not that far back. But again, it's dangerous, right? Because they're lumping saturated fat with trans or hydrogenated fats, which again, remember, are really, really different. What's interesting though is at the same time that all of this research is being done, there's this woman, Mary Enig, who is an amazing researcher, and she was doing research on fat and cardiovascular disease and coronary artery disease, and her results were showing really different things. And she was finding that her results were refuting everything that was being published. So all of the new government regulations, all of the new standards, and she keeps saying, look at this. I think this is saying something different. This is, not what we're telling people. Nobody was listening though, because the issue is, again, when it comes to sort of nutritional recommendations, is there's these major studies done, and the government gets a hold of it, and it becomes platforms, right, that people work with in there, especially in the States. It becomes a political platform. So I'm working to, create these new nutritional recommendations that are going to save people from dying of heart disease. And it becomes much bigger than a nutritional issue. It becomes a political issue. And so she's coming out, maybe 15 years later with results that are completely disagreeing with what was happening before, and just nobody wants to listen, because it means saying, okay, I think we were wrong, and we have to change everything that we were just telling you. So everybody's like, we don't quite believe you. But she's published great books, Eat Fat, Lose Fat, and she published that one. I put that one on there because she published it with Sally Fallon. I don't know if you know, but Sally Fallon authored a really amazing cookbook called Nourishing Traditions. Again, it goes way back, and it really promotes eating healthy fats, fruits, vegetables, meat, and if you're going to use grains at all, like sprouting, fermenting, like she really identifies the issues with digesting grains. And this was like ages and ages ago, and that cookbook is still like one of the most popular cookbooks. So again, there's people saying, I don't think this is right, but people aren't really listening. So as I mentioned before, the issue with a lot of the studies that were done and what all the recommendations were based on is that those studies were quite flawed. They were not good, and they are studies that would likely not be published today if they were done. So the first one, the study done on rabbits, can anybody think offhand why that might not have been a very good study? Not needing to know anything about science, just knowing about rabbits. Yeah.
Rabbits don't eat saturated fat.
Yeah, they're herbivores, right? Like it's like, I don't know, it's like feeding us dog food, and saying, well, when I fed Carol kibbles and bits, she got very sick, It's like, so dogs can't eat kibbles and bits. It's like apples and oranges. It's ridiculous to feed an herbivore saturated fat and then apply the data to us. So yes, rabbits developed heart disease, but that doesn't necessarily apply to us. The second one was the Ernest Keyes study. And so the issue with that was that he called it, the 6-country study or the 7-country study, but he actually studied more like 12 or maybe 18 countries. But what he did was, when he found outliers, and most of these were indigenous people, so like Inuit or African people who would have had like an almost entirely fat-based diet, and they would have some of the lowest incidences of death from heart issues. He just eliminated them. Then his line would have to look a little different than this nice curve up, right? There's no direct correlation when you add back in all of the outliers. So he just went, oh, that's just an anomaly. So I'm just gonna erase those. So terrible. But this is like also something to keep in mind when we're looking at research that comes out today, right? And I think Laura showed you, I got her to put in that first lecture, the pyramid of like research, clinical experience, so seeing how things actually apply to people when you do it, and then a little bit of self-experimentation, and knowing that we have to take research with a grain of salt, because all research, stuff like this is happening, right? Those don't matter. Cross them off. And then the framing of the study, what was interesting about that is that early on, they had found that people with higher percentage of calories from fat were more likely to die of cardiovascular disease. But 30 years on, the opposite was true. So when they stopped looking so short term at people and they looked long term, people with higher cholesterol levels are living longer. So at the very least, there's no correlation between cholesterol and heart disease, and it's quite possible that having higher cholesterol can actually be good for us in lots of different ways. Is everybody with me so far? Any questions or anything? Okay. And again, I think Laura talked a little bit about this, but in terms of like how long, like, you know, when we start to look at the research and when we really shifted our diets, if we were to look at our entire history as a year, it's really been about a minute that we have been really focused on low fat, getting our fat from vegetables, not eating animal fat, and we're just starting to see some of the negative effects of that. So who knows what we're gonna see in the next 50 years or 100 years, switching our diets up. So the importance of cholesterol, I think it's really important to talk about this because again, cholesterol gets such a bad rap. Like every single person that has any heart issue, regardless if they have high cholesterol or not, are put on cholesterol lowering drugs. And so I think it's really important to talk about the importance of cholesterol in the body, what it's there for, why we have it, and why it's really, really silly to just think that we can eliminate it and not have any negative outcomes. Cholesterol, I'm going to read this, like cholesterol is important in the health of cell membranes. So remember I talked about the fact that the cell membranes are made of fat and cholesterol is a really integral part of that. The regulation of hormones, all of our sex hormones come from cholesterol. They start as cholesterol. So hormonal balance, fertility, libido, all of those things are really linked into actually consuming cholesterol. Vitamin D, which is actually more of a hormone. You know, everybody talks about you need sun to make vitamin D, but we make it from cholesterol. So cholesterol is the beginning of making vitamin D as well. So you can see how it's just so important to our overall well-being to have cholesterol. The protection of the liver and lungs, optimal functioning of the immune system. It's also really important in terms of cerebrovascular flow, so blood flow to the brain and getting oxygen to the brain. Really important in terms of memory. You know, there's been lots of new, exciting, interesting studies about Alzheimer's showing that it's a metabolic disorder. So it's a sugar disorder of too much sugar, not enough fat, which is really, really interesting. So cholesterol, lots of super important things. And so what happens with cholesterol, or where the thought process were to come from, is if you were to have a cup of cholesterol, it's pretty goopy, thick stuff. And our arteries are tubes, and so the thought is that if we have too much cholesterol in our blood, it's gooping up the insides of these arteries, it's thickening them up, it's making them hard, and it's making it really difficult for blood to get through, which means oxygen can't get through. But the thing is that cholesterol is important for all of these things, but cholesterol also works as a bit of a band-aid in our arteries. So if there's damage, if there's microscopic damage inside arteries, cholesterol will show up and it will adhere itself to the artery wall, but it's there to it's there as a band-aid. It's there to fix a tiny bleeding leak. So cholesterol has a really important function. Obviously, if cholesterol is depositing itself in excess, it can cause issues. But the question to ask is, why is cholesterol depositing itself in excessive amounts? Why is it being needed to fix all of these microscopic tears? And so again, when we dig a little deeper, the issue again is sugar. Too much sugar in the blood causes damage to the inside of our arteries. And then cholesterol shows up to repair. So the analogy is blaming the firemen because they're there every time there's a fire, right? It's like you don't blame the firemen because they're there to put out the fire. It's like, why did the fire start? So I guess what I'm trying to say is in some sense there is truth to the fact that yes, if cholesterol builds up in our arteries, it can cause hardening and thickening of the arteries. But the problem is predominantly sugar, and then the other thing is inflammation from stress. from not sleeping well, from exercising excessively, all of the things that cause inflammation from eating foods that don't sit well in our digestive system. Anything that causes inflammation can also cause damage to the insides of our arteries, forcing us to need cholesterol to repair. So the take-home message here is that cholesterol is incredibly important. It does a lot of really amazing things for us. And while it can be laid down in arteries and can cause artery disease, it's not the source of the problem. It's the symptom or what we see as part of the problem. Yeah?
So if you are healthy, in that sense of the term, and artery healthy, and you're eating a lot of cholesterol, does the unnecessary cholesterol pass through your body?
Well, we have different forms of cholesterol, right? So, so the other thing I should mention is, because, the doctors also put people on like zero cholesterol diets. You hear this all the time. You can cut all the cholesterol out of somebody's body and their cholesterol will never lower. And that's because we make it, right? We actually make it within our body because we need it. So that's why they've started to introduce these drugs to try and get them down, because they cannot stop. You cannot stop your body from making cholesterol. But sorry, what was your question? I got myself off track.
If you're intaking cholesterol.
Oh, right. So, but then the other part of it is that we have different forms of cholesterol, right? So we have, and I think that's maybe my next slide. Different forms of cholesterol. We have HDL and LDL. And most people don't really know what the difference is. They know the LDL is the bad one and the HDL is the good one. And so the major difference is that HDL is high density lipoprotein, and it's high density because it has more protein. It has more protein within it. And it actually has almost like a protective shell around it made of protein. And so it's able to sort of travel through the body, and very rarely does it sort of like deposit in arteries. HDL is thought of as almost more of a scavenging, I can't say that word today for some reason, scavenging cholesterol. So it actually will go out into the arteries and it will actually pick up excess cholesterol and bring it back to the liver, because that's where all of these processes are happening. So our liver can actually break down excess, we can make more, we can reduce, we do all of those processes in the liver. LDL is low density lipoprotein, so it's a fattier cholesterol, less protein, more fat. And it actually, instead of going out and scavenging and returning to the liver, it just tends to go out into the arteries. So if your doctor is doing cholesterol panels, total cholesterol is useless. HDL, LDL is arguable, but it's definitely a better measure of what's going on in your body. So if you have a lot of high density lipoprotein or a lot of HDL, then you can argue that everything's fine. Because it's good. It's scavenging and it's helpful. So does that help you?
Mm-hmm.
But again, cholesterol is really self-regulating, right? Like we make it, we can break it down, we use it for different things. And again, if you have really high levels of cholesterol in your body, there's either too much sugar, too much inflammation, or you might just be someone who operates with a higher cholesterol level. Like, again, when they've done these studies trying to find correlation, there's people who have really high cholesterol that live to be 100. And there's people who have really low cholesterol that die of heart attacks at 40. The correlation between total cholesterol and morbidity or mortality from heart disease is almost non-existent. Yeah. So what else did I want to talk about? So let's sum things up. The early research was pretty crappy. That's basically the summary. And we made a lot of decisions, and we based a lot of our assumptions and a lot of our treatment plans on old research. And this is still really controversial. There's I heard this same message. There's this really good mind-body conference that happens at Harvard, and I think 8 years ago, a friend of mine went, and there was a cardiologist there talking about exactly what we're talking about tonight, saying, chronic disease, heart disease in particular, is a result of sugar and inflammation. That's what we have to control, sugar and inflammation. I hear it again. I've just heard it so many times, and yet it's still very controversial within the medical community, and that's just because most doctors learn what they're going to learn in medical school, and then they have very little time to sort of go out and seek out what the research is saying, and they're getting a lot of their information from pharmaceutical companies, and they make billions of dollars off statin drugs. So there's very little motivation to learn something different or learn something new. Tons of cardiologists, like there's a small, I shouldn't say that, there's a small percentage of the population that can benefit from statin drugs, and that tends to be middle-aged men with very specific cholesterol profiles, and they can benefit, but women in particular, no. Like, no. They have studied women on statin drugs, and women, postmenopausal women on statin drugs have a 48% higher incidence of diabetes. That was a study done, I don't know why I'm forgetting, but there's a Jupiter study done as well that showed a 30 or 40% higher incidence of diabetes. There's higher incidences of cancer from those drugs. They're like, for women, they're just bad news. So the goal the goal is to have a healthy heart and have a healthy cardiovascular system without having to worry too much about what our cholesterol levels are. And how do we get there? We get there by sleeping. We get there by exercising. We get there by eating healthy diets that aren't high in sugar. We get there by controlling our stress levels, meditating, doing yoga. So that's how we get a healthy heart. And a healthy cholesterol level, or a total cholesterol level, and a healthy heart are two really different things. And that's important to separate, because again, they tend to be synonymous. They tend to be put together or lumped together. So that's it. Do you guys have questions? Do you want to